Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Justice Sessions hosted at the University of North Florida by an interdisciplinary collective of programs and departments. I am Keith Cartwright of the Department of English, and I welcome you all to today's session on Gullah Geechee communities of Florida. So before I introduce today's panelists, I would like to alert everyone that we will have a question and answer session towards the end of the session. And I would encourage everyone to submit any questions you may have to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And we'll collect those at the end and launch the discussion from those Q&A submissions. Please put them in Q&A rather than in chat. So today we have some incredible guests. First, we have Saundra Morene, President and CEO of the Jacksonville Gullah Geechee Nation Community Development Corporation, devoted to the preservation of Gullah Geechee cultural heritage in Jacksonville and Duval County. She served on the federally established Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission, a national heritage area running up the coast from St. Augustine and Jacksonville all the way up to Wilmington, North Carolina. We also have with us, returning from last week's last session, Veronica Gerald, Distinguished Professor Emeritus with the Department of English and founding director of the Charles Joyner Institute for Gullah and African Diaspora Studies at Coastal Carolina University. So she's coming from Carolina. We have as well Anthony Dixon, originally from Fort Valley, Georgia, and he is the author of Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles, and the Second Seminole War, 2014, among other works. He has a Ph.D. in history from Indiana University and teaches at Florida A&M University. I believe he's coming to us from Tallahassee. So without further ado, I present the panelists of Gullah Geechee Communities of Florida. Thank you. Dr. Dixon.
Good afternoon. Just a quick clarification there. I am now running my own archival and historical research firm, and I am now located in Orlando, Florida. But I'd like to do as I always do, and that is begin at the beginning. And so our story actually begins in the 17th century. And we begin in the English colonies, particularly in present-day South Carolina and present-day Georgia. And what we find is a particular situation in which the enslaved Africans, particularly from the West Coast, are left in what we call low country area, which is a low-lying area along the sea islands. And they are left alone because these are low-lying swampy areas with a lot of mosquitoes that carry yellow fever. And so their English plantation owners were afraid to live in these areas because they were highly susceptible to this disease. So this left them in this area a lot of times alone to eke out their own existence, so to speak, in terms of cultural concepts. And so they did just that. They developed their own culture that we call Gullah and their own dialect and language that we call Geechee. And so they began to create this culture as time goes on throughout the 1600s. But at the same time, the Spanish are seeing this development of plantation society by the English as encroachment of their land. And so there's competition in the quote New World over the East Coast. What happens is that the competition gets such that in the Spanish began to realize that the only way that the English are going to expand and continue to encroach on their land is by the way of plantation society. And how plantation society is going to develop is by the number of African slaves they are able to acquire and bring into the area. So they began to counter those measures and began to seek out ways to slow down the plantation growth of English colonies. So by the time we get to the late 1600s, they're noticing that there are these African slaves that are beginning to abscond and run away from English plantation society. And so they see this as a tool or a weapon against the growth of English plantation society. And they begin to allow these runaways to actually come down into present day Florida and what was considered La Florida and live. And this development grew such that by the time we get to the end of the 1600s, the King of Spain actually produces an edict that we call the Edict of 1693. And in this edict, he basically guarantees freedom to any runaway slave that comes down into La Florida. And this begins to develop in what we call a dual society. There are those that are given the ability to eke out their own existence in the wilderness. And then there are those that are given actually the ability to live under Spanish rule outside of St. Augustine at a fort to which we call Fort Mose. Now, it's important to understand that at the same time, there are Native Americans that are also trying to get away from English plantation society. So they're actually coming down into La Florida as well. And so we began to see two distinct groups of Native Americans and Africans that are eking out their existence in the wilderness and sometimes cohabitating with the Spanish in and around St. Augustine. The majority in the beginning, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the majority of the communities that are eking out their own existence are living and dwelling around the St. Johns River. The St. Johns River actually becomes the pathway to freedom for many of these slaves. And this is our first indication, and we make the argument here that the first Underground Railroad actually came southward, and that the St. Johns River was the pathway to freedom. Now, as we move into the 18th century and into the 1700s, more and more Native Americans are coming into the area as well as runaways that are beginning to understand that they can come into La Florida, and they're understanding that they could create their own existence. And so we see the Gullah people coming into La Florida in larger numbers. Now, the problem is, at the same time, plantation society is actually still growing in Georgia. And so what happens is they began to come into the area and they began to colonize what is present day Georgia. Now, what this does is that it changes the migratory patterns for these runaways and for these Native Americans that are trying to escape plantation society. And so they began a migratory pattern westward, in which they began to migrate into present day western parts, what we considered at that time western parts of Georgia, what we can consider southwest Georgia as well as southwest middle Georgia. And so from that point on, we start seeing Native Americans and these runaways begin to create societies in which they are cohabitating and coexisting together. A relationship develops such that they are living and commingling, and they're also having their own villages separate from each other, but in close proximity. Now, the relationship between them goes as such. There are actually 3 fields that you will find in the region. There'll be one field that the Native Americans, they grow their crops on. There'd be another field in which the blacks would grow their crops. And then there would be a third field in which they grew together, which was called the tribute field, in which the Native Americans would keep the proceeds of the crops, or keep the crops rather. Now, this was done in paying homage to them for protection against the encroaching English and those slave owners who would like to try to come and claim them as their own. Now, at the same time, we start seeing a problem or a schism among the Creek Native Americans in present-day Alabama, which they considered, again, this would have been considered the western portions of Georgia. What happens is that the Native Americans there within the Creek Nation is under the ideas that plantation society is causing a rift. You have your northern Creeks that live in present-day northern Alabama. They do not accept plantation society. They do not accept the ideology of slavery and slaveholding. Your southern Creeks, however, are beginning to accept plantation society, and they were actually beginning to buy and trade slaves with the English plantation owners. This causes a major skiff between the two. And so what happens is the northern Creeks push their way through Alabama and down into Florida, and they begin to commingle with the other smaller groups of Native Americans, and they become a homogenized group of Native Americans. By the 1750s, this group of homogenized Native Americans are now known as the Seminoles. And this is where the beginning of the Seminole Nation occurs. Now, by the time we get to the late 1700s, all types of things have changed. The English are out, the United States is now born, and these English planters are now considered American planters. The Spanish have gone through periods where they have had to give up Florida, La Florida, and then they regained La Florida. But in doing so, it left them weak at best. They were basically ownership in name only. And what we find is a clear division between planters that are coming in on the East Coast and coming into present-day Jacksonville and St. Augustine area, and then those Native Americans, those Seminoles, and those blacks that are now on the western part of what was considered West Florida, which we would consider Tallahassee, the area of Tallahassee, on back further west. Now, when we get into the early 1800s, the War of 1812 changes everything for La Florida. In the War of 1812, what we find is that both the British, the Americans, and the Spanish, although they are barely in control of the area, all recognize the importance of the international ports. And these international ports, we like to talk a lot and discuss a lot about New York and Boston. But at this time, the ports of Tampa, all the way over to New Orleans, those ports in Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, they were considered the primary international ports because they had a strong relationship with the Caribbean, which was still the primary export of goods. Now, when we get into the early 1800s, American plantation owners are urging something be done to the Seminole Native Americans and these runaway blacks, because they see this as a direct conflict to their growth. They see this as a direct problem. As long as there are runaways in La Florida, then their slaves will always know that there's a chance that they can run away and be free as well. And so by the time we get to the end of the War of 1812, we have what we call a war within inside of it, the Patriots' War, in which the British, in their last stand, are pushed out of La Florida, and they're pushed out of the area all the way back to New Orleans. But they recognize the Native Americans, they recognize the Seminoles, and they recognize these runaway blacks as their allies. And so they do one crucial thing that sends horror and shockwaves throughout plantation society. They leave the blacks with a fort. And this fort is about 60 miles outside of Tallahassee, and it is known as the Negro Fort. And again, this sends shockwaves throughout plantation society, because a fort means that these Native Americans and these blacks are well on their way to creating their own colony. And they cannot have a free colony of blacks this close to plantation society. And then they also recognize that the land in between Tallahassee all the way over to the Swanee River is quite fertile. Not only is it quite fertile, it's almost, well, in some areas, it's more fertile than the land that we see growing the cotton plantations in Georgia. So they see this as a direct conflict to plantation growth. And so they entered what we call the First Seminole War, in which they destroyed the Negro Fort. Now, what is important to understand is how these Negro wars go. They end up fighting three Florida wars, end up being 3 Seminole wars. Now, it is important to understand that each war indicated a growth for Florida. After the First Seminole War, Florida then becomes a territory. The war ends in late 1818. In 1819, they are signing an agreement with Spain, and by 1821, Florida is a territory of the United States. What happens, though, is that when they push these Native Americans and they push these blacks out of the North Florida area, down into the Tampa area, they do two major things. They put them in an area that is inhabitable at that time and causes even more discourse between them, between Native Americans and the Americans. But they also push and force the blacks and Native Americans to come into even more of an agreement and more of an alliance against them. And so at this point, we stop saying Florida Maroons and Black Maroons, and we begin to call them Black Seminoles. And so by the late 1820s, they are coming back into North Florida. In the early 1830s, they are reclaiming some of the land that was lost during the First Seminole War. And this sends them into a Second Seminole War. Now, it's important to understand that the Second Seminole War is the longest, deadliest, and costliest Native American war fought by the United States government. I know we like to hear a lot about Geronimo and Sitting Bull, but it is actually the Seminoles along with the Black Seminole allies who put up the largest fight. This war goes from 1835 to 1842. When this war ends, Florida then becomes a state in 1845. So we can see another direct correlation between a Seminole War and how Florida becomes part of the United States. It's also important here to understand that during this war, the first the ideas were to recapture all of the Black Seminoles and capture in some instances and place them into plantation society as enslaved individuals. Well, because the war went on and those fought so vehemently against it, the United States was forced to go into the Articles of Capitulation in which they agreed to let the Black Seminoles immigrate out west and live free from slavery. So what we see is Gullah people actually gaining their freedom. And we now see them in a diaspora that includes the Black Seminoles, because they keep the language, they include Native American words. So the Geechee dialect, Geechee language then turns into what we call the ASC, the Afro-Seminole Creole language. And so again, it's important to understand that when the war ends in 1842, just a mere 3 years later, Florida becomes a state. And it's also important to understand that through these wars, through the First War, particularly the First War where Andrew Jackson is concerned, this is where he gets his ideas for Indian removal, for his Indian removal policy. And then it is the Second Seminole War, which is fought under that guise of the Indian removal policy once Andrew Jackson becomes president. So it's important to understand how they shape the war, and not only the wars and how Florida goes, but they also shape US policy as well. Now, there was a third Seminole War that was fought in the 1850s, just before the Civil War. This war actually opened up South Florida. And so we see again how the third war indicates the growth and expansion of Florida. Thank you. I think we're going to hold questions until the end, correct? All right. So this is how we see all of these wars and how the story of the Gullah Geechee people developing into the Black Seminoles and into a diaspora, and how it directly relates to Florida and its statehood.
Thank you much, Dr. Dixon. And we can move now to our next presenter. We're saving questions to the end. Veronica Gerald, I believe, is going next. Or
screen up for her. Yes, she is.
Thank you.
Let's put her screen up.
You ready to do the screen share? Okay, so click up here, right there. Screen share, and you're gonna do your PowerPoint. Yep.
I believe we need to unmute here. Veronica, I believe you're on mute.
Dr. Gerald?
I believe she's on mute. She needs to unmute.
Okay, Dr. Gerald is going to do language, and until she unmutes, she's going to show how the language itself began to travel as the transatlantic slave trade came into being. Jacksonville, of course, was actually came on as a city in 1822, as Dr. Dixon has explained. During that time was one of the major occurrences in Florida. And as she moves into her language, she will be able, oh, great, great. Okay, so I've explained to them that this first slide is going to be a part of your presentation, and from this, we're going to move forward with the slide presentation.
Great, great. I wanted to dovetail in on what Anthony was saying about what happened once the renegade slaves came into Florida early on, and just to kind of bounce a little further back to the Carolina colony, and how we figured into the whole scheme of things. This map really shows how, I call it the Out of Africa map. It shows where people went after they were taken from Africa. And many people, since history tends to kind of be consistent, it tends to talk mainly on the American diaspora, what happened once they came over to the USA. But one thing needs to be understood is that as these different Africans were scattered across the globe, they brought with them language that already had an ancestor, an antecedent on African soil, because language was always needed to be used between the different tribal groups as they traded and did business with each other. There are over 400 ethnic groups, and so there is a kind of language that already existed between them. And we saw that when I just during a recent trip to Sierra Leone, the various connections between that and Gullah Geechee language. And so as these languages, when we look at this map, if we can just imagine that not only did these people come as labor, they also brought with them language, folklore, beliefs, practices, culinary arts, and just many things went with them. But the one pathway that I wanted to look at today that fits in with our discussion is how language is a constant. And as we look at a constant, whatever the pathways are, or whatever pathways take place, that one infrastructure influences a lot. So by the time we had a movement into from Africa into the Carolinas, we are looking at 40% of the Africans who came to the USA made entry into the Carolina colony. The Carolina colony, from its very beginning, was a Black majority, primarily about what was said earlier about malaria and how it interacted and did not find itself well among the European culture, but the Africans were able to somehow deal with it. And as a result, places like the Carolina colony were 80% Africans. It was said that one European traveler came in by boat to Charleston, and he wrote back in his journal entry saying that the Carolina country looks like Africa to him. So there was this clustering that took place that had a big impact on what later happened when they met up with the Seminoles and other groups in Florida, because the infrastructure was set in an environment that was 80% African. Not only was it 80% African in the Carolina colony, it was very isolated. When you come to the Carolina colony now from the air, you see nothing but bridges. But then there were none. So you had a kind of colony that was separated by many bodies of water, which made it very inviting, of course, for the plantation society. So as these people began to set up, they also began their militancy as early as Denmark, VC, and the Gullah Wars and that kind of thing. They had kind of honed their skills to make entry into a kind of diaspora brought on by the offers of Florida and what it brought to them in terms of freedom. So by the time there was another meeting up, you really had within probably one meeting of Gullah people along with the Seminoles, you probably had some 50 African ethnic groups right there on the spot, because they came to the Carolina colony and therefore honed the culture itself in the Carolina colony. So they brought with them a stronger language that had kind of combined a lot of African languages, Southern language, and a lot of creativity, I like to say. Because the thing with Gullah Geechee language is that it is such a combination of so many languages that it deserves its place as one of the most unique and long-lasting languages in the country today. The thing that when you look at the linguists and the way that they discuss the language, it's very difficult to understand what's happening. So when I came to a kind of academic discussion of Gullah, I had to do what a lot of English speaking students do. I had to really look at my language, because a lot of the language that was set up for me as examples were Ambrose, I can't remember his last name now, but a lot of the kind of what we call plantation creations of white writers. So I did not see the Gullah that I grew up hearing in the language that I was reading. So when the linguists began to ask for phonology and different ways of looking at the language, I didn't understand. So to kind of make a long story short, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened with this constant that remained among all of our pathways. And I really think, and Anthony, you might disagree, I think they were also afraid of the strength of their language. You know, you were talking about things that they were afraid of with this meeting of the culture groups, if you will. I think they also knew that it was something in the language itself. It was unique when you look at the diaries of travelers also to the various Southern plantations. They always make reference to the way that the Gullah spoke. They didn't know yet what was going on. People didn't learn about us as a culture until after freedom. They just thought it was just little uniquenesses about the Carolina, Florida, Georgia slaves. They talked funny. But once they started to realize that the language itself had some logic to it, for years we had spoken about the fact that we had problems with the languages, that the extra large lips, thick tongues. We always gave reasons why there was a problem with African Americans or pocket community people like the Gullah Geechee, who tend to create their own language that doesn't make it to the graduation stage in standard English. One of the things that if you're going to look at the language and kind of understand it, you have to understand that it's a lot of creativity. And it's a lot of built on rhythm, meter. One of the reasons that Gullah is sampled in rap music is because it has a beat. So when a lot of the linguists are looking at the language itself and start looking at the kind of structured ways of looking at the language, they don't get the nuances like rhythm, beat, meter, and ways that you put words together to make it make sense. An example would be in Gullah, there are, I'm not sure what the professional name is for it, but we tend to slide words together. Like you may say, I am going to the store in standard English. I am going to the store in standard English. In Gullah, we squeeze some together like I'ma go. So I am going becomes I'ma go. You cut off endings, but it's a difference when you say I'ma go to the store as opposed to I am going to the store. So the rhythm and the meter makes a difference. As we began to mesh with the different cultures like the Yamasee Indians and the Indians on your side, the various groups and Seminole connection, once that happened, I think we kind of found out by accident that language was our strength. So we put together a language that would help us to communicate. So I noticed we're looking at, if I can go back to that screen on the vowels. In English, you're taught that the vowels are A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. That was the old way of learning your vowels. But in Gullah, the Y is very strong. And not only does it function as a vowel sometimes, it also functions as a consonant. A good example with the vowel Y is it can become a consonant. Like you would take a word like I hear you, like here. Now the H is going to historically bring problems in the pronunciation. So most of the time, an H beginning will be avoided or will not be used at all or be left off. But sometimes it's replaced by another consonant, or in this case, another Y. So the word here becomes yeti. So someone may say, come into a room, and instead of saying, did you hear me? They would say, yeti. And the speaker, the hearer, knows exactly what is meant. So again, you see a kind of, it looks like it was a need to have shortness in communication. If we were maroons, for instance, yeti, as with a question mark behind it, is less to say than do you hear me? So I see a lot of ways that language played into the rebellions and the ways of creating music and song. A lot of people argue that a lot of the hymns of the old days were where we use language and vagueness to create messages. I'm not a scholar of that whole concept musicology, but I do know that language goes beyond just communicating. It goes into ways to talk about a single person in a room, but instead of saying he or she, you make it they, so that the single person in the room does not feel that he or she is the subject of gossip. Which brings me to another issue with the language itself. We did things that welcomed our history of language. Certain combinations of consonants, for instance, once we met with it in English, if it did not negotiate itself well, it became something else. A good example would be words that begin with TH. That those vowels, for instance, they function sometimes between, as I said, consonants and vowels themselves. And in a lot of cases, in the pronunciation of the vowel has to do with how the particular word is being used at all. So with the TH, there's too many things that have to be accomplished to perform that pronunciation. So instead of the TH like that, there, them, then, take the TH away and add the D, which is a much more comfortable and historic positioning of talking, of using. So there they go there. You can have a whole sentence without the TH sound. If you put the TH on the end of the word, it then becomes another issue. So it becomes an F or a TH. So with, instead of saying I am going with you, and remember the sliding, I'm gonna go with you. So when you look at it independently in the US, we don't see the kind of historical development of the language that came from so many directions, but the language itself becomes political as the plantation society and the powers that be began to see that communication was a weakness rather than a strength, where it came to the Gullah Geechee who had come into Florida and the Seminole group who had started to form prior to their entrance. That language then becomes a part of not only the fierceness, the desire for freedom, but it's also a pathway toward being free, becoming free. We can imagine when the young lady that I talked about last week in my story, who was kidnapped out of her yard when she was 7, she didn't realize yet that this would be a day and time where everybody would talk. In the story, her line is, "They been look like she, but they ain't talk like she." When the Africans began to realize that they didn't understand each other, so this third language that people tend to call it, I don't like the word pidgin, but I can take a melding together of languages and words, that kind of thing, to create communication, and I can go with that. But this the vowels, just wanted to go through them just to kind of give you guys a way to go home and practice. The A is usually the higher position of the tongue. You'd seldom hear it as an eh. Even with an apple, if it's not too quick, you will hear apple, apple. I want an apple. So it becomes ah. The E, it's not used a lot as a vowel. It's most often used as a pronoun. E is a pronoun that means he or she. It doesn't, there's no difference in there. Either eat, either go home. So that can be either one. So, but it's a E, it's a strong E, but not as a vowel, as a pronoun. Then you have I, it's usually the I, like it's a problem because it's not a comfortable position, as I was saying earlier. So I often becomes like instead of saying first, it becomes first. You're the first one to graduate in the family. So E the first one, And sometimes it'll be something that just change it, like fish. You hear down in Gullah Geechee country all the time that I want push, push. It takes on the U sound, pushing grits. So when you go to a restaurant and you hear the waitress ask you, "Do you want fish and grits?" You're like, I'd rather have the fish and grits because that way it's cooked correctly. But anyway, so you can't teach language in 10 minutes, and I just wanted to throw some things out. But a name for those who are interested in starting their journey and learning that we have a bilingual culture right among us. Our children are bilingual. They can speak standard English and Gullah Geechee. They need to know that that is a plus. And if you want to start that as an educator, a good book to start would be Lorenzo Dow Turner. In the 1940s, he was associated with Fisk University, a sociologist, took a big, heavy tape recorder around the country and he interviewed people, and his novel became Africanisms in the Gullah dialect. That's a good starting point. And of course, Gullah now is so popular. There are lots of things on Google. But I also wanted to say that one of the places that I found my most original Gullah when I was trying to look at it, rather than hearing it from the mouths of outsiders who interpreted it as the way it should sound. One of the things that I like to do was to go to the WPA narratives that were recorded, and thank goodness President Roosevelt with that idea that we need to record the ex-slaves still living among us. And we also can give people jobs by being interviewers. And that was a wonderful project. There were over 2,000 taken, but the Gullah in the narratives from the Georgia, South Carolina, Florida is very good. I mean, that the interviewers, who in most cases were white, had good ears, because you have to have a good ear to hear the vowels and the nuances that I just hit on slightly today. But thank you for at least making this a part of this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Gerald. So what we found is that education, inspiration, and development are things that are needed in the Gullah Geechee culture. And as we look at Florida, they clean Jacksonville. This is part of Highway 17, Main Street. It goes all the way to Miami Homestead. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Management that we should take a look at has layers of management, which Dr. Gerald's brought out: Gullah Geechee language, the Gullah Geechee culture and heritage, Gullah Geechee culture and heritage quarter, which spans the 4 states. It affects 50 million people. We also have a Gullah Geechee management plan, which is 760 pages of resource. And we have a Gullah Geechee cultural heritage resource study that the National Park Service started on in 1980. It was put out in 2014. It's a total of about 500 pages. 200 and is actual documentation, and it also has over 200 pages of reference guides. So it took the National Park Service a very long time, I'm sure, but we're going to have to go back to that resource study and complete it. The Transatlantic Creole Society that Dr. Gerald was talking about came as a result of trading, and that trading and the language that took place during the trading took place in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There is such a thing as an Atlantic Creole Society. That is because we were in the middle of the wind of sails. There was no steamships during the time of the transatlantic slave trade. So it took a very long time to get from Africa to South America, to the Caribbean, to what we now know as the United States, Canada, and trade goods. This Afro-creole urban cosmopolitan centers all over were formed. In Jacksonville, we have starting in about 1700s, the Chesterfield Plantation, which is now Jacksonville University, Floral Bluff, which is a little bit south of Jacksonville University, and it was home to the Bigelow Mansion, which burned down in 1950. Potts Plantation took place in 1769 through 1784 during the English occupation of the area of Arlington. A part of that was Strawberry Plantation, which is in Clifton. We still see that house standing today. The McNeil Plantation in Ready Point sits at the end of University Boulevard. It used to be called Chaseville. It is now Charter Point. St. Isabel X Plantation was Blue Cypress. And Blue Cypress is now a preserve or a park as well. The Potts Plantation, which was 10,000 acres, is now a subdivision. During the occupation of Spanish after the English in 1780s, around the 1780s, the Potts Plantation was broken up into about 8 plantations. The Visit Jacksonville African American Trail kind of gives you an idea of what an up-to-date portion of that trail will look like. It really only touches on the African American story in Jacksonville. This map is a railroad map, and it actually shows at the bottom the number of people who own plantations by number. Gullah Geechee communities of Duval County area, Hansontown, which is in the middle of Jacksonville near La Villa, Brooklyn, which came about prior to the Civil War and lasted after the Civil War, our Black Point settlement, which is closer to the area of the Atlantic Ocean, and of course I just named Chaseville, which is around University Boulevard. We're going to then go over to Mill Cove, which is in the Arlington area as well, and Fulton, Cosmo. When we get to Northwest Jacksonville, which has been gentrified, African American, but is probably one of the biggest areas that we can take a look at. And it actually goes all the way back to the beginning of the inception of the city, which was in 1822, right after the last Gullah War. Cosmo is an area that we are now celebrating with Freedom Park, which is about to open. We cannot forget Polytown, which of course is very close to Jamestown. Those two areas just came on the scene when fill dirt from the Polytown area was used for 295 around Main Street, and we found that bones do talk. The Oakland area is another area that's in the media now. Believe it or not, with Metropolitan Park and the Department of Interior's National Park Service not allowing the Four Seasons Hotel to be built, is because the people from the Oakland area were always supposed to have access to the waterway. And if that is not included as we go on to progress, then those people in the East Side area will not have any access to water. The Phillips, around Phillips and Emerson, the Red Barn Plantation came into that area. We now have communities like Gaddis Quarters, Grant Road, on down Old St. Augustine Road. And then we'll move over to Sweetwater, East Mandarin, and Edisto, only to name a few. As we unify our nation, this United States of America, we have to always recognize the brilliance of James Weldon Johnson as he placed in the last stanza of his poem, which gave us a real humility to the poem, where he said, "True to our God, true to our native land." Ernest Henley, after his amputation of his leg, wrote Invictus. And Invictus, for many Gullah Geechee sororities, fraternities, and people during the early 1900s, this poem was put to memory because for Ernest Henley, it meant one thing, but for the African-American Gullah community, it was a poem that really meant courage, because we had to have courage in order to move from where we were in 1860 to where we needed to be as everything progressed for us. Dr. Gerald is going to say it in Gullah, and I will then read it after she has said it.
Out of the night, what covered me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank you, whatever God may be, for my unconquerable soul. In the veil of clutch of circumstance, I ain't winced, nor did I cry out. Under the bludgeoning of chance, my head be been bloody, but I ain't bowed. Beyond the place of wrath and tear, loom but the horror of the shade. Yet the menace of the year find and gon' find me not afraid. It matter not how scrape the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am master of my fate, I the captain of this your soul.
Fourth stanza, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. As we create new models of change, we ask you to take a look at Dutton Island Preserves, where we see an exact replica of the landscape. We all view slavery from different paradigms. We must look within and make a decision on how we are going to move forward. Jacksonville Gullah Geechee Nation is a 501c3. We're here to educate, inspire, develop, preserve Gullah Geechee history and heritage. Dr. Cartwright.
Thank you very much, Saundra, and to all the panelists for a very rich, multifaceted presentation. We could talk all afternoon about any one element in this presentation. Thank you very much. So we have time for a question or two. Audience members, if you have any questions, please present them. I would ask myself, you know, we hear a lot about the isolation of Gullah Geechee communities, but what I'm seeing and hearing is a certain kind of cosmopolitanism, certain kind of real cross-cultural and multilingual awareness. What would you say about, you know, this certain kind of Atlantic cosmopolitanism, or even a way of Gullah Geechee people may have been more aware of the dynamics and cultures around them than perhaps anyone else was? I don't know. we're looking at the Seminole, we're looking at a long, rich array of cultural knowledge.
You know, Charles Jonas says something in his book, Down by the Riverside, that resonated with me early on in my study of my culture. He said, what happened on American soil could not have happened on African soil, because so many ethnic groups came together. It became I like the word cosmopolitan. It became a coming together, if you will, of the essence of a belief system. What sits in the middle of a belief system is what brings groups together in ways that they work together on different levels. And there seemed to have been, I don't know what the research reveals, but it seems to have been that in these groups that came together, the infrastructure was similar. It could be something as common as a love for the earth, or talents of reading the stars. It could have been something as simple as that. And it could have been language.
Well, I think that we were able to actually see many cultures uh, under one umbrella because of the amount of things that we did. We went from the field to becoming the actual hospitality for the United States of America for a very long period of time. So we were able to see people from all nationalities in a different light than we were during slavery. And I think a lot of that was brought back home to the household. And the training was then taught. We had a large number of African Americans that became Pullman porters, and they moved from one area to another and always brought back home the essence of what they learned. So the culture itself began to survive on a different level. So as progress came with the African American or Gullah Geechee, that as progress came with the United States, it also came with the Gullah Geechee. And I think that the Afro-creole dynamics really took hold.
I have another question from the audience from Jeremy McKinney's. He says, thank you for this lecture. This was fascinating. And he asks, how do I join Jacksonville Gullah Geechee Nation, CDC, or simply get involved?
Well, I'd love for you to give us a call. Our website is GullahGeecheeGlobal.com. And there's a phone number, contact information there that you can give us a call, and we will definitely call you back. And we'd love to have you join the organization and actually volunteer with us with all of the things that we do, all of our projects and programs, from children to adults to seniors. So we'd love to have you. Jacksonville Gullah Geechee Nation CDC website, GullahGeecheeGlobal.com.
Thank you. And we have a question from Kimberly Gutierrez, and asking, when we speak of the wars that were fought, to frame them in the proper context, is this something we would consider an eradication, a genocide? Is there a known estimate of how many natives and Geechee were killed? And goes on to say, thank you all for coming together to speak on this rarely spoken of devastation incurred by such a beautiful culture.
Unfortunately, the Gullah Geechee culture lives primarily on a strip between Wilmington, North Carolina, and St. Augustine, Florida, along the coastal regions and about 30 miles inland. It's estimated that 500,000 people live in that area, but we've moved all over the country. You know, we talk about going to college when schools were segregated schools, and you went to college, and the Gullah girls kind of hung together because they could speak the language better than we could, and they always distinguished themselves. But I think that the whole idea of coming together outside of Africa shows itself in many ways, and I just wanted to make that point before we ran out of time.
Thank you. Dr. Dixon?
Yes, historically, it's virtually impossible to give exact numbers for a couple of reasons. One is that for the obvious reason of warfare, they didn't want to give the exact numbers because plantation owners were in with the idea rather that every Black Seminole, every Black that was in the company of a Native American was a runaway. Even though they may have been born in freedom, may have been born in La Florida, they may have been even third generation. But the way plantation society, the ideas of plantation society said that if your mother was enslaved, then you were enslaved, which means whatever original inhabitant that you could trace your lineage back to, they were enslaved, which means that you belong to someone as well. So to give exact numbers would be virtually impossible to do in terms of looking at the exact numbers during the Seminole War. Now you can look at the muster rolls of those individuals that did leave, and you can find those rolls primarily out in Oklahoma, in the archives of the University of Oklahoma and the state archives out there. And they'll give you more exact numbers of how many that did immigrate out west. But the exact number will never be known because it didn't behoove, to say the least, it didn't behoove the Native Americans nor the Blacks to give their exact number. And as a matter of fact, that would have been even more detrimental, even in terms of guerrilla warfare, to give the exact numbers of where they were in terms of their fighting positions would have proved to be detrimental as well.
Thank you. I know that when the Negro fort was attacked and the explosions that went on in that fort, that was devastating losses. And it's, as you say, the longest, bloodiest war this nation fought against Native and Black peoples. Thank you so much to the audience. Thank you especially to the presenters on this rich panel today. You know, we've touched on Jacksonville, we've touched on Jacksonville's cosmopolitanism, and we've looked at the Seminole Geechee presence here in Florida and beyond. So thank you again. We will reconvene in 2 weeks. Our session 2 weeks from today will be led by Richmond Wynn and True Leverett, titled Self-Care for Social Justice. Thank you. This concludes today's Justice session. My thanks to all.
Thank you for inviting.
Thanks again.
Thank you.